Hello and welcome back to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, we're breaking down the year in the comic book industry in two parts. In part one, we'll look at the state of the comic book industry as a whole, as well as what things were going on in society that may have impacted the comic book industry during that year. We'll talk big picture about what's going on at DC and independent comics, then we'll shift our focus to Marvel. We'll look at who is creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics debuted or ended. In part 2, we'll dive deep into Marvel's longest running characters, Matt Murdock. We'll look at what the year had in store for the Man Without Fear, key things that happened, and who joined or left his world before spotlighting one key issue or story. From there, we'll wrap up the year's discussion with a takeaway before moving on to another year and a whole new discussion. We're excited to have you join us on a trip through comic book history. We are back for another year. It is 2001. My name is Dwayne. With me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, this is going to be an interesting year, I have a feeling.
It is, but I mean, the year 2001 is going to have a dark shadow over it pretty much forever.
Yeah.
When you're an American
Yes.
and you think back to this year and you think about it too much, you always end up hitting the rough spot that is the end of the year. There are a lot of elements of the year as we get later, even with comics, that are overshadowed by that. But nonetheless, the start of this year actually brought a lot of great entertainment for us. It was also the first time in a long time that the yearly sales data actually showed some sort of signs of an increase. Now, technically, we're going to find out there's kind of an asterisk by that, but I think at this point in the comic industry, it's one of those we'll take it situations.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I would imagine, given recent years.
So, but yeah, it's an interesting year. Welcome back to 2001, everybody. Let's see what happened.
The year in comics. All right, Dan, we are in 2001. We're looking at comics as a whole. We've been starting with talking about movies and TV shows. I imagine this week is more of the same. We actually had some more movies and TV shows, I think, that were comic book based this year.
Yeah, kind of start just by talking about some of the stuff in the greater world that comics were interfacing. We just had kind of that big merger of DC partnered or the DC parent Warner along with AOL. We're still seeing a bunch of kind of the parameters of how that's going to work start to shake out a little bit. Marvel is adjusting to the fact that they're still trying to figure out a way to get some of their products on screen and to start getting Marvel Studios to actually be a thing. So they've just recently renamed Marvel whatever it's called. They've just recently renamed the Marvel production departments that are based out in Hollywood to Marvel Studios, and have started actually talking about making their own movie studio and making their own movies. It's going to be a while before that really takes effect, but we're going to start seeing in the comics relatively soon some of the impacts of that, as they actually are building towards it a lot earlier than maybe you think.
LA. Okay.
But in terms of the movies we actually got this year, there were a number of them. From Hell, which is an adaptation of an Alan Moore story, starred Johnny Depp and Heather Graham, had a budget of about $35 million, made about $76 million, so it was not by any means a blockbuster. But for one of those sort of mid-sized movies, this was a pretty solid hit, and I think everybody was pretty happy with that. It had mixed reviews and the like, but nonetheless, I think it was a pretty successful adaptation. I believe that Alan Moore was still angry about it, but I don't believe there's ever been an adaptation made of anything Alan Moore that Alan Moore wasn't angry about. So
okay,
it's not too surprising. Ghost World came out. This is actually early Scarlett Johansson, like her first comic book movie. Also starred Thora Birch, who technically was really probably the star of the show. And then Steve Buscemi is in it in a kind of a supporting role as well.
Okay.
Sounds like you may have seen this movie.
I remember it. I I don't think I ever actually saw it though.
I have seen it a number of times. It is a fantastic movie. It's also a really tough movie. Like it deals with difficult topics and does so really well. So this was an adaptation of Daniel Close's story. He actually did Ghost World as a series of chapters or as a graphic novel back in the day, early 90s or so. Essentially, this got 4 of 4 stars from Ebert. It is still at 90 some percent, I think around 93 on Rotten Tomatoes. It has cult classic status. And I guess more importantly, even though it was 7 million to make and made a grand total of 8 million at the box office, meaning at best it was a wash when you talk about advertising and all the other stuff, it has had a long tail on terms of home video and DVD sales and everything else. And I'm sure at this point has become a very successful, uh, you know, when you take the whole term of the project and
Yeah,
put it
yeah,
together.
no.
So
This is, I think this is something I'm gonna have to look into. I'm a big fan of actually Steve Buscemi, and Scarlett Johansson's great in all the comic book movies I've ever seen her in.
you know,
So yeah, I think this is probably something I should look into seeing.
it's a very different Scarlett Johansson.
I
Um,
yeah, I
Not
would
only is she
imagine.
blonde, but I think she's still a teenager when, like, probably 16, 17 years old when they make this, because it's the story of two teenage girls, and then their interactions with this sort of, you know, relatively solitary loner type geek, and it all gets very, very messy. And
Oh,
I don't want to talk too much about it, but
sure.
it's a good show,
Okay.
but it's a difficult show.
Okay.
Um, Probably also those two are the sort of the highlights movie wise. After that, we had Josie and the Pussycats, starring Rosario Dawson, Rachel Lee Cook, Tara Reid, and others.
That I remember. I definitely did not see that.
I have watched this. It is not great, but I mean they were cool. And the weird thing is this has also had one of those reappreciations over the last decade or so,
Okay.
where a lot of people now look at it as a sort of sly satire of commercial culture and a
Oh,
lot of things
sure.
like this in a way that it just seemed sort of, I don't know, weird when it originally came out. So it's actually not a terrible movie. It's not something that I would really recommend running out and watching. But if you're stuck some evening watching Josie and the Pussycats with your, daughter or something, it's not going to kill you. Um, it did take a loss though. It was $30 million budget, and they only made back 15. So it was a an initial critical failure and also a box office failure. But if you want to talk about critical and box office lack of success, we have a clear winner this year in Monkey Bone, which is a Brendan Fraser and Bridget Fonda movie that was absolutely awful. It was, they say, um, loosely based, I think is the term a lot of times it's used with these things, on
Sure.
Kaja Blackley's Darktown, which is a graphic novel out of a small company called Mad Monkey. Um, it cost 75 million to make. It brought back 7.6 million. It was
Ooh.
repeatedly panned in the press as a terrible movie, and it is now mostly forgotten. It has not been critically reevaluated as some sort of hidden gem. It's just an awful movie. So yeah,
I was gonna say I don't recognize the name of that film at all.
it's probably for the best. It's probably for the best. So those are the four sort of big Hollywood movies that got made this year that were based on comics that I found. We also did have Justice League Secret Origins as an animated show that came out this year. This is another one of those that Bruce Timm was overseeing for Cartoon Network. It's all sort of interwoven with the Justice League animated show and the rest. So these spawn out of the Batman animated series universe, Superman animated series universe, that sort of stuff.
Uh, gotcha.
These are mostly pretty entertaining. So there have been a number of these coming out. I haven't actually noted all of them, but we were pretty late on movie and TV this year, so I wanted to note that. And then on TV, probably the most important of the TV shows that we're going to be talking about in a long time. Smallville actually debuted in October on the WWB. So this is the Tom
Yes.
Welling,
Yes.
Michael
Yes.
Rosenbaum Smallville.
Did not watch it, but very aware of it. That was very widely. I think that one got quite popular and definitely hit a more than just a comic book audience.
Yeah, this was 9 or 10 seasons. Welling was fantastic in the role. This was during that sort of no capes and no flights era. So they wanted to have a Superboy essentially, or a young Superman who is not, is kind of distancing himself from the comics. But it was really, really good. And I not only watched these when they came out, but then I watched them again with the kids a couple of years ago. We watched through the entire 200 episodes of them when my daughter and my son were probably, in their 11-year-old type of range, and they both really enjoyed them. So there's the sort of thing that can be enjoyed by a family. There's a few racy scenes that had to be fast forwarded, but for the most part, it's pretty laid back sorts of superhero fare. But I
Wow.
really did enjoy Smallville, and it set the stage for the whole WB Arrowverse that we're going to be talking about coming up.
I was thinking it seemed like that was sort of the jumping off point. There ended up being quite a few DC shows that ended up being on the WB as a result of that.
Now the Smallville is not in the Arrowverse. There's actually the Superman and Lois Superman is the Superman from the Arrowverse technically that comes at the tail end of all those shows instead of here. So Smallville's in a different kind of its own universe, its own
Sure.
I guess what you'd call like
I
Earth or
I
whatever.
yeah, I guess what I mean is the success of Smallville then led to what I think ended up being a very
100
fruitful relationship between DC and the WB.
100%. This was the thing that started Arrow, started the Flash, Legends of Tomorrow, all those things sort of owed not only the fact they got made, but a lot of their tone as well to Smallville. That sort of, superhero soap opera kind of feel. Um, they definitely found a pattern in Smallville that then got picked up and brought into the other shows.
Okay. All right. So what about DC and comics? What about
I have one other thing first that's outside
okay.
of sort of the range of DC, and it's not television, so I'm sticking it here.
Okay.
One of the most famous covers that any magazine or the like did in the wake of 9/11 was on September 24th. The New Yorker actually published a black cover just a couple weeks after the two towers, and it looks, when you first look at it, like it is a just black sort of cover in mourning, but when you look at it in a certain light, it is two-tone, and you can actually see a silhouette of the the twin
Ah,
towers in
sure.
the twin towers of the World Trade Center in the cover. And that was actually designed by Francois Mouly from an idea that she got from her husband Art Spiegelman. And Mouly, of course, was one of the people who for a long time had been working on like Raw, the comic book, the independent comic magazine. Spiegelman's
Wow.
the guy who wrote and drew Mouse, that sort of thing.
Right.
So very, very famous cover, and it does have a comic connection to it as well.
Of course. Yeah. Definitely worth pointing out. Okay. Now DC. What's going on over at DC that we should take note of for 2001?
Man, DC had a busy year. It really had a busy year. The first thing, as far as sort of for DC, is that Frank Miller returns to the Dark Knight Returns universe. So Dark Knight returns
Sure.
essentially in a title called
Sure.
The Dark Knight Strikes Again. And this is by Frank Miller and Lynn Varley. There is one name missing from this that I think is critical, and that is that Close Johnson did not return to do finishes on Miller's art. This is a very controversial series. It's one of the things that I was really, really looking forward to. This this was sort of the thing that drew me back into going into my store like every couple weeks or whatever just to see if it had appeared. because the publication schedule was not great in terms of when they came out. But the problem is that the art and the story were not really what we were hoping for in terms of, I did not like this much at all. But nonetheless, it was Frank Miller returning to the Dark Knight universe. It sold gangbusters for them, and it was a great idea. Just don't know that it really landed the way we'd liked. It does have its fans. There are some people who really like the direction that Miller went, but this is sort of the beginning of a lot of his really sketchy, more experimental style. And then also some of the things he did with the characters, like having a Dick Grayson who turns into sort of one of the villains and the like. There's a lot of things in there that folks didn't necessarily love. We also had in one of the bigger crossovers this year, Lex Luthor being elected president, which it's an odd time to be talking about this, but it is weird because again, I think a lot of us who are comic fans owe comic writers a debt of sort of apology, because I remember when I was reading these thinking these stories are just absolutely stupid, because how would you ever convince the people of America to elect Lex Luthor president? Well enough.
Sure.
Comic writers of DC Comics, you know better than I do.
Is art imitating life, or is life imitating art here?
You know, so that's kind of interesting. That storyline went on for quite a lot through the year. Stan Lee actually moved to the DC universe for the first time ever this year, writing a series of books called Just Imagine, where he takes over essentially characters like Batman and does his own take on them with his own character based sort of like, what if Batman was a Stan Lee creation type of thing. And so the Just Imagine books are a lot of fun, actually, and they sold pretty decent as well. It was also a little bit weird, though, obviously, to have Lee doing anything with the Distinguished Competition, considering how fiercely they'd been fighting for decades.
Right.
Phil Jimenez took over Wonder Woman. I want to mention this mostly because this really started a renaissance for the Wonder Woman title. There'd been a number of years where Wonder Woman had just sort of lost its way. And Jimenez is somebody who really has kind of almost like a George Perez acolyte type of feel to him. He's got a lot of the same ability to draw things very elegantly. His women are absolutely beautiful. And when he came on, it was just a perfect fit on the book. They started out with a series called Gods of Gotham, and it really sort of brought Wonder Woman back to being a far more respectable part of the DC universe again after a few down years. So Jimenez really is a fantastic artist. He's been working on some recent Wonder Woman stuff too that is really good.
You've got something, a crossover here revolving around the Joker.
Oh yeah. We've got a couple of them actually, a couple crossovers still. Joker's Last Laugh crossover is the Joker thinks he's dying, and so he basically goes around and decides to do all of the horrible things he can.
So as much chaos as possible before he passes on.
And then we also had the Officer Down crossover in the Bat books where Gordon gets shot. And so he gets shot in the back like 3 times, and then there's a big who did it and etc. He survives, but nonetheless, so that was a big thing as well. It was a good year for the Batman books in all, I think. So, the Dark Knight Strikes Again may have been a little bit of a miss, but the other ones were pretty interesting.
Kevin Smith jumped back into comics again.
He did. So after his glorious return in Daredevil, which, it's interesting how all of the delays and all of whatever are forgotten when it turns out that he turned in a story that kind of sparked a creative renewal. Plus that connection to to Hollywood is big. So DC decided they wanted to bite of the same apple. They went and found him.
So they brought him back in to do Green Arrow. Green Arrow had actually died a few years ago, sort of saving the universe, as heroes tend to do.
Well, they found a way to bring him back. due to comics logic and everything.
Right.
He'd been replaced by Connor Hawke, who was actually another an acolyte of his. Um, and then when he came back, it was something called the Quiver storyline. Phil Hester was doing the art. I love Phil Hester's art. And it was kind of like the Daredevil story that he did, where it was a relatively specific storyline, comes in, does all of this, and then he's off to do something else again. But the book actually carries on for quite a while and was one of my favorite comics of this time period. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, very nice. Any other things revolving around DC before we move on and look at some of the independents in
I
comics this year?
think the main other thing is just to note that DC is still trying to find ways to attract a larger audience. They still want that bigger pool. So
Okay.
they brought out a thing called Cartoon Cartoons, which is a kids comic, and also Bionicle for kids, getting into the Lego Bionicles sort of thing, trying to find a way to do that. Those were also a crossover where when you bought Bionicles, some of them would actually have a comic book, a DC Bionicle comic book in with them, sort of like back in the day when you bought an Atari cartridge and you got an Atari Force comic book along with it.
Ah, okay.
So, and then also DC got the Star Trek license back, which has ping ponged around all over the place.
I
Marvel's
was
had
gonna,
it, other people.
I was gonna say it feels
You
like
know,
that's been here, there, and everywhere, so to
yep,
speak.
it is kind of crazy. So they're the ones who brought it back and started up a couple three new Star Trek series this year. Uh, Other than that, we do have their other imprints. Wildstorm had a number of new things come out. The Monarchy, Jezebel, some things like that. The single story mini or single character mini series from a lot of their team books, that sort of thing. Vertigo brought out American Century from Howard Chaykin, a new sort of cheesecake book called Codename Knockout that I actually quite enjoyed. There was one called The Crusades, which was essentially like a history adventure type of thing. And there was Sandman Dead Boy Detectives, which at the time didn't seem like it was that big. It was just another Sandman story. But that actually was turned into a Netflix series just a couple of years ago that was actually pretty good. So that was where that began, was here in 2001.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then the last thing, they also established CMX, which is a manga imprint.
All right. So outside of DC, what were some of the independents doing this year?
This was one of those years where I well remember all of these books coming into the store, and I really enjoyed a lot of them. There's a new one called Frey that was actually Joss Whedon sort of behind it. There was Alan Moore's Glory from Avatar. We had a couple of kids' books that came out. Girl Genius by Phil Folio and Amelia Rules by Jimmy Gonley. Both got their first sort of printed collections. Some of them had been online and the like before then, but these have become fantastically popular in the sort of like scholastic or bookstore market. They maybe didn't never make quite as much money in the direct sales market, but nonetheless, they found quite a lot of fans elsewhere. You had a bunch of sort of the more like sexy heroine things. There was one called Bad Kitty by Brian Pulido. A lot of things that sort of looked like they were Witchblade imitators. There also was a new Witchblade series. So remember that TV show had started and was actually on on television right now. So that had inspired a lot of other people to not only try and get a comic like that out, but then hopefully see if they could manage to get a TV series of their own off of that.
Sure.
Um, CrossGen actually started a bunch of new books. They started Crux #1 from Wade and Epting, Roos by again Wade and Butch Geiss, Scion by Adam Hughes, Sigil written by Moeller, and Sojourn, which was one of my favorites by Ron Mars, and Greg Land. So, and again, Greg Land, there's different opinions on him, but these were actually some of the books back when he was first starting out, where I think some of it, either I wasn't as used to the way he did all of his swipes, or he was doing it less, and I liked some of the art in those. But CrossGen had a good year. They were ramping up and doing a bunch of stuff. We're going to see that they have a 2 or 3 year pretty good run, and then they disappear.
Okay. So it looks like Angel and some other Buffy spin-offs were starting up this year.
Absolutely a huge year for Buffy. There were like 5 or 6 series or one shots by Dark Horse based on Buffy, Angel, any of that sort of stuff. Dark Horse also did Grendel, the Devil Inside, and Hellboy Conqueror Worm, as well as Ring of the Nibelung. They had a bunch of really, really good comics. Not so much new stories, in terms of new characters, but Grendel returns. There's not every year there's a new Grendel story, so it's always cool when there is one. Uh, Mignola's really sort of settling in at Dark Horse with his Hellboy stories, doing some great stuff there. So they had a good year. PvP, the first player versus player collection comes out from Dorkstorm this year. I don't know if you've ever read any of the PvP collections, but they are actually kind of fantastic. Originally, it's a webcomic by essentially Scott Kurtz that was launched way back in '98. It got its first collected edition this year. And it's essentially about a group of folks who have this video game magazine, video game review magazine, and kind of all their adventures and everything. And it's pretty fantastic. There's attack pandas every once in a while, things like this. I really
Right.
enjoyed these a lot, but they're in a different form factor. They're the long kind of comic strip books normally. So
Oh, okay.
nonetheless, good stuff. They're a lot of fun. Fantagraphics actually had an interesting year looking at their stuff. They resumed Love and Rockets, the beloved long running series from the Hernandez brothers, but partly to finance that, they also went all in on their porn line. So we had Alice in Sexland, Allron, Blowjob, Super Tattoo Extreme, Wear Slut, and a bunch of other books. And I'm just
Wow.
astonished by some of them where I'm like, oh, well, subtlety is not really in order
Yeah,
at this
we're
point.
we're not even we're not even
Right.
trying to
Right
trying to
out the door on
sugarcoat
that
this,
one.
I guess.
So yeah, it was a little surprising some of the stuff they brought out. But that is how a couple of the more prestige type ones actually did manage to. I think we've talked about this before, how they managed to fund their more mainstream books, or not mainstream, but what they would consider their prestige books, is by having you know the sort of other content that they put under a different line and market to make some money. So outside of that, we have Vampirella returning from Harris. The Incal was first printed in America this year, which is Mobius's collaboration with Jodorowsky. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Volume 4, which has Peter Laird still involved with it, started up this year. And Image was really busy. They started to ramp up again. They got into licensed titles like G.I. Joe. They tried a number of manga titles. I think Area 50, 51, 52, whatever it was called, is one of them. They brought out a lot of limited series in different genres to sort of see what would stick and what would sell. So they're also starting to see that the market is getting a little stronger. And so they're starting to try and find more places to bring out new titles and figure out what's selling in the 21st century. We got a book called Boneyard by Moore, and Queen and Country comes in from Oni with Greg Rucka and Rolston doing it. I really love Queen and Country. It's sort of a James Bond as a woman type of story.
Okay.
It was done mostly in black and white. In fact, I think it was all black and white, even the later ones. It's got kind of a rougher style, but it is fantastic comic books. Great stuff.
You have one last note here about Captain Underpants.
I have not mentioned these for a while, but it did strike me that I really should mention as we get to, these getting into these eras, that while all of these others are out there doing their thing, Love and Rockets may be great, or Queen and Country, but they're being outsold 10,000 to 1 about
Sure.
by Captain Underpants and his various graphic novels. So Captain Underpants and The Wrath of the Wicked Wedgie Woman by Dab Pilkey came out this year. It's the 5th book in the series, massive seller. And this is actually where, as Marvel and DC and everybody have sort of just given up on trying to market to kids, Dab Pilkey and Scholastic and some others have sort of taken up that mantle and are making huge bank on all the money that Marvel and DC are leaving behind.
Yeah, and then they've got the inroad because they're going through the schools to do it too, I imagine.
That is definitely a big part of it, but to be quite frank, a lot of this stuff just sells everywhere. It doesn't matter
Sure.
where you're at. I think that Captain Underpants would have sold great on spinner racks in the 70s and 80s as well, probably.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I'm not trying to suggest otherwise. I just think that if you have an audience that is not being served, and you're
yep,
giving all those kids got the pamphlets that had all the Scholastic titles in there, and they're bringing it home to mom, and they've had a chance to look at it. And they're like, "I want Captain Underpants." They're like,
yep,
"Okay, we get it."
absolutely. Those things they were everywhere. Absolutely everywhere.
All right, so let's talk about some of the industry trends. We looks like we had a price increase this year.
So kind of. Um, Basically normal comics for most of the year were 225 to 299 depending on where they're coming from and the like. Trade paperbacks ended up being in the $10 to $15 range. What's interesting is how long prices held at that level. Like literally just up until a couple of years ago, maybe even now, there are some DC books that are still 299. Or I don't know if that's the case. I think about a year ago the last ones went away. But they tried to hold that line for a long time, and you can still get a lot of trades for in the area of 10 to 15. They're probably 15 to 20 is probably more common now, but a lot of the introductory ones, especially, are still like $10. So we'd been through the big price increases of the late 90s, and now things sort of stabilized. And I think part of what we're going to see is that for the first time in a long time, publishers are starting to find ways to make more money by selling more copies to different people instead of just milking more money out of the same small groups.
Okay.
So that's nice. We like that. This year, though, did start slowly. The first half of 2021 was pretty rough. The second half, things actually really started to strengthen. Um, Partly that was because you had The Dark Knight Strikes again, which came out. It had a $7.95 cover price, which was crazy, but it also ended up being the best selling title of the year. So in terms of actual gross revenue, it would have been like triple what any other book was probably. The Green Arrow relaunch also did well for DC. G.I. Joe books sold well. The Marvel's Ultimates sold well. And of course, everything X-Men still sold well, right?
Yes,
Um,
that juggernaut just keeps on
no,
going.
And then also, of course, we did have at the end of the year some of the 9/11 memorial issues, which also sold really well, and I think were pretty well received overall. Marvel did a couple of memorial issues, including Amazing Spider-Man number 36, which was one that again had kind of just a black cover, and it was a sort of an issue where Spider-Man and some of the other heroes were just sort of trying to trying to figure out what a hero does in a world where this has happened, you know. And and also there's a little question of how can this happen in a world where, why doesn't Reed Richards just stick his arm out and, you know, grab the plane and pull it away or something like that. So that's one of those places where reality and fantasy start to have a tough time sort of intersecting as well. But
Right.
but yeah, so overall though, what happened is comic titles came back, and the first half was bad. The second half was good enough that by the end of the year, we had about a 1% drop overall in sales. But the second half was the strongest half that comics had had in almost a decade.
Wow. Okay.
So the second half of the year was really good and gave us a lot of sort of, you know, ability to look forward to 2002 and go, okay, so comics maybe have found a little of their groove again. Lone Wolf and Cub dominated the trades market, along with Powers and the Akira trade paperbacks. Also, Wonder Woman and Spider Man were good sellers for Marvel and DC. Um, and then also we had uh, Ultimate Spider Man Volume 1 came out, the Bendis Ultimate Spider Man, and that sold really well as well. So trades again continuing to make gains, and it's interesting how different the trades are. Like X-Men trades really don't go anywhere, but X-Men dominates at the direct market stores. And then stuff like I guess, Lone Wolf and Cub or Powers and stuff like that would sell okay, but certainly they're not, or even the Wonder Woman books certainly aren't making the kind of sales at the store that they're making at bookstores.
Oh. So, who then had was the top
Well,
publisher this year then?
well, that's hard to say. So Marvel actually regained their unit share, selling 37% of all comics. DC was down at 31, almost 32. So it was a substantial gain by Marvel in terms of unit sales, but probably largely just on the strength of Dark Knight. DC actually won the share of overall dollars 31% to 30%. So
Wow. Okay.
Marvel sold more books, DC made more money. There we go. And then other than that, Image, Dark Horse, CrossGen, Wizard, Viz, all sort of came in, and Chaos Comics actually popped in as a seventh comic company that sold over 1% of the market. And I think that's also a sign of health, is when you have more and more companies that can take up a decent percent of the market share. So we've been 5 or 6 companies that have been over 1% for the last probably 2-3 years. Now we're up to 7, 8 companies that are over 1%. I think that's a good sign of an improving healthy market as well.
So, what about new publishers this year?
Number of them. We had Airship Entertainment, which published those Girl Genius books. Admiral Entertainment, which brought out a series of Cave Woman books, and I believe they are still publishing mostly just Cave Woman today. Like it's a whole company, one line, Sexy Cave Girl. That's their thing pretty much. Digital Webbing had a series of anthologies called Digital Webbing Presents. Vertical did a number of manga books. Vertical did a number of manga books. One of the ones that they've been well known for is like the Chai's Sweet Home cat books. But they've been doing a lot of stuff for many years. They're still running now, so they've been going for over 20 years. And then there was a new one called Anarchy that did a series of vampy books, which again, sort of sexy vampire girl. There's an awful lot of those out there these days. So
Sure.
as we continue to see the market change, the one thing that remains the same is there's still an awful lot of books that appear to be sort of aimed at 25-year-old males who still think like 14-year-old males. So
Sure.
and I've been that guy, so I cannot necessarily judge, but nonetheless, it is odd just how much of the market is slanted in that direction. So
Of course.
we also saw the start of Toonpedia. This is actually a very interesting place. If you've ever go there, we'll put the link in the show notes. But it's the work of one guy. So Donald D. Markstein has gone through and basically done write-ups of thousands of characters and groups of characters, and from comics and from comic strips and whatever. And it's literally one of those the work of a single person type of things that you just have to respect.
Wow.
So kind of cool. If you haven't taken a look at it, go out and check it out. It's kind of like a tiny little Wikipedia all his own. So
Very nice.
and I believe Wikipedia premiered this year. So he actually was starting this at about the same time that Wikipedia began. So
Okay.
other than that, when we're talking to beginnings and endings, we can also talk about Dan DeCarlo of Archie Comics, passed away this year. One of the great Archie artists. And 3 EC guys, actually. Johnny Craig, Jerry DiFuccio, and Greg Evans, all of whom worked with EC sort of during their golden years. We lost in 2001 as well.
Okay, let's move on and let's talk about the Eisners for 2001. Is there what was getting recognized as the best of the best for this year?
So Dan Clowes continues to get like awards and plot. Dan Clowes continues to get awarded for his 8 Ball Eight Ball number 22 gets best single issue. Amazing Spider-Man number 30 to 35 by Straczynski actually gets best serialized story. So it's a strong start for him on Spider-Man this year. Best continuing series, Azzarello and Rizzo's 100 Bullets, which I absolutely loved, so I celebrate that. Hellboy wins, Queen and Country wins, Hero Beer and the Kid, which I talked about last year a bit as one of my books that the kids loved, actually does win best title for a younger audience this year, which is absolutely a great play by the Eisners, as far as I'm concerned. As usual, sort of, Radioactive Man, which is one of the Simpsons type comics, wins for best humor publication. There just weren't that many of them out there, and they were doing good work. Best graphic album, in terms of new ones, got a rookie here, a guy named Will Eisner, who's coming in yet again with a new book called The Name of the Game. He had 2 last year. He's got another one this year, and obviously not just making them, but making them well enough that he's winning his own awards still.
Right.
So
yeah,
just kind of embarrassing for everybody else at this point, you would think.
Yeah. So best writer is a name I recognize.
Bendis with the first of a number of best writer awards. He did Powers. He was on Alias, Daredevil, Ultimate Spider-Man. We're going to talk about pretty much all of those when we get to Marvel. He had a very good year. Best inker or as far as best artists, best writers, that sort of stuff. Dan Clowes won for best writer. Eduardo Rizzo for best penciler. Charles Vess for best painter. Best coloring, we had Laura Dupay. And for best letterer, we had Tom Klein. Outside of that, Hall of Fame, Sergio Aragonés, my man. So one of those guys who not only is in the Hall of Fame, but has a Hall of Fame named after him. So that should not surprise anyone. Charles Biro goes in. John Buscema goes in, one of the Marvel greats. Dan DeCarlo, in the year he dies, goes in. John Romita, another of the Marvel greats. And Osamu Tezuka, Japanese sort of foundational comic manga artist. So a good class.
Very strong group there.
Yeah.
All right. Before we turn our sights to talking about Marvel this year, Dan, what was your favorite non-Marvel comics in 2001?
So much good stuff. But I think the main things I was looking forward to were 100 Bullets, Powers, and Queen and Country. Those are the ones I would. I can't get it to one, so you're just going to have to take it.
We'll narrow it down at least a little bit anyway. Yeah. All right. We've looked at the movies and TVs shows. We've talked about what DC and the independents are doing. Let's focus now on what Marvel was doing in 2001. The year in Marvel.
Excelsior!
All right, Dan. Marvel got back to being the number one seller, even though they didn't make the most revenue. So that's got to be good. What was going on with Marvel this year?
You know, I really think this was a great year for Marvel Comics. And not just in terms of, they had some really good stuff that came out, but more than that, they just took a right turn. They had been kind of lost, and they finally found a road, and they started following it. And the books that came out this year were really solid, and they continually kept setting a foundation for being able to tell good stories going farther into the future. And so just a really, really solid year for Marvel Comics in general. Quesada continues to sort of just right the ship and make the right moves and bring in the right people. And it was really nice looking through these and just seeing all of the stuff that was coming in that we still sort of enjoy and look at as quality stuff today.
Gotcha. All right, so let's talk numbers here a little bit. How many total series did Marvel have this year?
176, almost exactly what they had last year.
Yeah, that sounds right. New series this year?
127.
And how many ended this year?
117. So we gained 10 titles.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
Another year with more new titles that began than ending is,
yep,
I think, a good sign.
yep, and that's what you need to do if you're going to be leading you know, leading in sales. Is you got to have some things out there, and they have actually started to build now and get some of that back. So yeah.
So, what was the year's event or events that occurred?
Yeah, so they hadn't had events for a long time. Like last year, they kind of dipped back in a little bit, but now this year, we do have the Eve of Destruction event, which runs through the X-Men books, and Casada has started to get things kind of back to where they're starting to play around a little bit with events. They were kind of off limits there for a while as things were crashing. I
Right.
think also they were just so disorganized and they had so few editors and the like that actually keeping track of crossovers probably was
Would be
just
difficult. Yeah.
almost impossible. But Eve of Destruction actually dealt with the legacy virus and a cure that had been found. They finally found out a way to actually like inoculate people against the virus, but the only way it would work is if someone had it injected into them so that it could take effect and then that person would die. And Colossus ended up actually sacrificing himself to save the rest of mutant kind at the end of this story. So that was Eve of Destruction. It's the big crossover, and it's also essentially the death of one of the original new X-Men, Colossus.
What were the best-selling Marvel comics this year?
They had one called Heroes, the Heroes Special, which was essentially a book that sort of turned the spotlight off of the superheroes, and it was the superheroes essentially saluting like the firefighters and the policemen, some of the first responders and stuff like that who had risked their lives and done the rest of the tough work during 9/11 and the days that followed. And that went over really well. Fantastic issue, really well done. And it sold a lot of copies. Um, we also had Wolverine the Origin, which sold really well. Amazing Spider-Man number 36, we talked about that one, the one that had the all black cover. And then outside of those, you still had 31 of the top 39 issues having an X in their title, including all of them from the 8th to the 27th best-selling issue for the year.
More X-Men domination, huh?
So again, Dark Knight literally just cleaned the floor with an entire year of X-Men just with that one series. It's kind of crazy because DC still beat them, even being that outnumbered.
All right, so you mentioned Death of Colossus as one of kind of the big things that happened this year. Uh, Looks like Marvel leaves the Comics Code Authority.
Yeah, after decades, basically since the 50s, Marvel has been, with very few exceptions, putting that Comics Code Authority stamp on, where they submit it to the code to be, judged safe for children and the like. And they decided to stop, and they went instead with their own rating system, which is sort of a PG-13 mature type of rating system that would mirror more what parents and people would know off of the movie system. And
Gotcha.
essentially what they wanted to do was that the problem with the code was it was binary. You either put the code stamp on or you didn't. So there was no real chance of doing a PG-13 movie in
Right.
comic terms because it was either PG or it was R, right? And
Right.
so because of that, they decided that they needed a little bit more flexibility on that. You'll see that actually on the books as we go through now this week. Um, you'll see that Daredevil, for instance, does not have any kind of symbol on it, but some of them, like I think maybe the Daredevil Yellow books, had a PG-13 or something like that on them.
Gotcha.
So
Is
no,
so is that what they're still using today?
I think it's changed a bit over the years. Like most of our Daredevil and Moon Knight stuff now, I think are rated like teen plus or something like
Okay.
this.
Okay.
So T plus, you can see it in the little area down by where the scan code is. It's not something they really publicize as much now. Um, I think because there's just no kids in comic stores, so why would you have to worry about it? But uh, but in any case, they do have a different system that's kind of evolved over time.
Gotcha. Okay. So what else do you want to highlight for things going on with Marvel this year?
I think the main thing is the number of top writers that we're going to be seeing come on to titles. Straczynski, Bendis, Morrison, Millar. When we talk about notable new series coming out, almost all of them are writer driven. And so that's probably the biggest thing. And then just the fact that even at the end of the year, you do start to see, with the Spider-Man 36 and a lot of things, you start to see a tonal change in some of the Marvel books simply because Marvel for 40 years has been associated more closely with New York than almost any fictional universe
Right.
has ever been,
Yeah.
I mean, it's like essentially Marvel's, New York is to Marvel what London is to Sherlock Holmes, right?
Right.
And
yeah.
so with the attacks on the Twin Towers, it really does affect a lot of the people who are writing for and making Marvel comics, because many of them live in New York. But also, I think they just find it's difficult to sort of have that elephant in the room all the time of how are people in New York just going on with their lives and not talking about this. Even as they're also dealing with the idea that they are escapist entertainment and they don't want every time you open a Marvel comic to be a downer.
Right.
So it's interesting to see how some of that starts to seep in as we get near the end of this year, and then because the last couple months of 2020 or 2001 are going to be post 9/11 books.
Yeah. I remember it started in the Daredevil titles this week. At the end of the year, we had the little Twin Tower graphic thing and the flag and the
Yep.
In the shape of like a little knot thing. I don't remember what that's called exactly, but yeah, a tribute to the Twin Towers and everything like that. And I imagine we're going to see that for quite some time.
Yep. So that's one thing. I guess other than that, yeah, we'll just really start to go back, and as we look at some of the notable new series and stuff, what you're going to see is a lot of names of writers and runs that are going to define the Marvel universe for a long time.
All right. Well, let's talk about some of those new series then. What are some of the notable new series from this year, and presumably the writers associated with them?
So the new X-Men start up. Essentially, X-Men is renamed to New X-Men, and a guy named Grant Morrison takes over. Frank Quietly comes on in art. Quietly is an absolute genius. Morrison is a genius. I've had a tough time with some of the X-Men books over the last however long, but these were kind of just a joy to read. And they were weird and they were quirky and they were cool. There's a guy named Zorn. Well, I have Zorn in under our notable new characters as Zorn ? Because I'm not sure if he should be listed as a notable new character or not. And I'm not going to expand on that, so don't ask. But it's a really interesting series. I like the new Morrison run, and he's going to put things into play in these books that are going to have sort of ripples down through forever. He's going to have a long run on the X-Men, and it's going to matter.
Okay. That's not the only X title you have here.
No, there's a bunch of them actually. Ultimate X-Men with Mark Millar and Adam Kubert. I think it's Adam or Andy. Starts up. That's going to run quite a long time as well. This is sort of, again, Ultimate Universe versions of the X-Men. They're back being teenagers, kind of just at the start of their careers. Gives them a chance to reboot things and do stuff differently. Ultimate Marvel Team Up, another one that lets them kind of go through, and this is a shorter series, I think, but lets them go through and team up some different heroes of the Ultimate Marvel Universe that maybe don't get their own book. We get Punisher, a new Punisher series by Ennis. We get Alias by Bendis and Gaidos. This is a fantastic series. That's essentially Jessica Jones. This is her first series. So these will
Oh,
be
okay.
some of the ones that the Jessica Jones TV show are based off of. Alias is a very weird book because it is really more of a private eye book, kind of like something that would be Rockford Files if the Rockford Files was set in the Marvel universe and Jim Rockford was a woman who used to have superpowers and be an Avenger, but now isn't. That
Gotcha.
makes any sense. Amazing Spider-Man with J. Michael Straczynski starts out this year. He comes on, had never really done comics before. He'd done them. He came on after doing comics at a couple other places like Rising Stars and things like that. Quesada continued to try and bring in some of this talent from Hollywood and the like. These are fantastic books. He has a long run on this. Then he goes on to redefine Thor in ways which are fundamentally important to the Thor movie coming up in another decade. So it's hugely important runs there. We get a new Defenders run. So this is also cool. It's like Marvel's starting to now bring back some of these series that have been gone for a while. Maybe feeling like, hey, now it's time to reintroduce the Defenders. See if we can get something
Right.
going here. We get Elektra. This is the new Bendis Austin title. Did you read any of these?
I did not. I did not read any of these.
So I read all these back in the day. I don't remember loving them that much. I reread a few of them, getting started, like researching for this. I still do not really love them. They are they are really, really weird and talky, and it's Bendis at his navel gazing best or worst. So those were not really my thing. Exiles. This actually came out of there was a Blink series. Blink was a new mutant, and not a new mutant, but a mutant who is new. Just to classify
Right.
for those of you who would question this, um, and she kind of started out with her own 4-issue miniseries, and then that brought in this time traveling group called the Exiles. And Exiles actually went for 100 issues.
I
So
was going
this
to
is a
say
book.
this looks like it ended up being quite popular.
Nope, Judd Winnick, Mike McCone were the ones who started this up. Went for quite a long time. As you can see, Ultimate X-Men also went for 100 issues. Extreme X-Men for 43. New X-Men, another 43 after what it already was. So a bunch of these. Punisher, Elektra over 30, Alias 28, Ultimate Spider-Man. Well, those are the collected editions. Yeah, there were 22 of them. So it was a good year for bringing in series that actually stuck, but more than that, series that actually had some impact in terms of they were really memorable.
So what about on the more limited side? What did we see as far as notable limited series that came out this year?
Because the first one to note, just kind of as an interesting one, is after, what, 40 years or almost 40 years, Marvel decided it was time to take a look at kind of their greatest hits. So they polled people, I think on the internet, and then reprinted the 100 greatest Marvels of all time. Um, and in doing so, they went through order by order. Daredevil, our friend, comes in at actually number 11. He doesn't make the top 10, but Daredevil
Just barely.
227, the Born Again story, actually comes
Right.
in as the 11th highest issue. Wolverine number 75, where he loses the adamantium out of his claws, came in at 10. Ultimate Spider-Man number 1, the Bendis book from just 2 years earlier, actually came in at 9. X-Men number 1, original from the 60s, came in at 8. Avengers number 4, where Cap comes out of the ice. Then Amazing Spider-Man number 121, which is the issue where Gwen Stacy died. And then when we get down to the last ones, number 6 was X-Men number 1 from 1991, which is unforgivable, but there's not much I can do to go back and change this poll now. Giant Size X-Men number 1.
What? So hold on. Why is X-Men #1 from 1991 unforgivable being
It's
number 6?
it's the highest selling comic book of all time. It's the one that sold 8 million copies. And it's got Jim Lee art, but it's not really that good a story. There's nothing about it that
Okay.
actually. Anyway, this is my opinion. Sure,
Okay.
all of the
Gotcha.
people with 100 copies of X-Men #1 in their basement who are depending on it going up in price are going to yell at me. Giant Size X-Men #1 was number 4. X-Men #137, which is the death of Jean Grey, the end of the Dark Phoenix arc, was at 3. And we had Fantastic Four #1 and Amazing Fantasy #15 as numbers 2 and #1. So first appearance of FF, first appearance of Spider-Man. So it's an interesting list because it's got a lot of like some of the real classic hits, X-Men 1, Fantastic Four 1. It's got some real recency bias with a few of them.
Right.
Like the X-Men 75 and things like that. And then it's just got a couple of really solid stories in the Daredevil and the X-Men 137 and Giant Size X-Men #1. So, or Death of Gwen Stacy as well. So, yeah, it's an interesting list. But they republished these, so you could actually buy the issues as like whatever through whatever, and then they would have the comics reprinted there along with some little commentary on them and stuff like that.
That would be cool.
Yeah. We also had Daredevil Yellow. Came out this year. Which was pretty interesting stuff.
We're definitely going to be talking about that in next week's episode when we get to the year of Daredevil.
Yeah. Wolverine: The Origin by Jenkins and Cooper, which Wolverine's origin had always been very murky. They'd never really wanted to get too much into it. He was that man of mystery. And this is actually where we first start to see Wolverine as a kid. And we find out how old he is and where he was born and a little bit of his tragic backstory. So it was a cool series. It was really beautiful series. The art was cool. Story was well done. So if they were going to do that, they're going to give away a bunch of those Easter eggs. I think they did a good job on it. Outside of that, there were a bunch of other just Black Widow type of series, Rogue, Magic, Excalibur, so a lot of X type things. There was a Space Knights one, which I think was associated back with ROM somehow. But there's a number of different series that came out this year, sort of across a bunch of different genres, just to try and or characters, trying to get an idea. Well, if the market's starting to loosen up a little bit, which characters are they that are going to be the ones they're going to want to try and bring back?
Gotcha. Okay. So what does that mean as far as new characters? We get some characters of note that debut this year?
We did. Ecstatics came out as a group. Milligan and Allred debuted those. So we got we got Anarchist, Yugo Girl, Mr. Sensitive. He's a bunch of names, but so a bunch of members of that group. Negasonic Teenage Warhead was created by Morrison and Quietly. She's been in a number of the Deadpool movies.
Yes.
The Exiles, along with Morph, some of the others came around this year. We got Beak, Angel, Tempest, No Girl by Morrison and Van Sciver, Jessica Jones, of course, by Bendis and Gatiss, and then Elsa Bloodstone by Abnett Lanning and Lopez. So Bloodstone, she's had kind of a feature in one of the Werewolf by Night special. Jessica Jones had her own Netflix series. So really a lot of these characters are ones that have sort of featured in, and even I think Beak and some of the others, Blink, ended up being characters that have been in the X-Men movies as well. So
Gotcha.
Yeah, it was a useful year for creating
there's
characters that are going to go forward.
Definitely some recognizable names in there.
Interestingly, again, though, and I think this is because it really is just a matter of the Marvel Universe has been this sausage fest for so long. Almost every character who's created who really stuck is a woman. Because to be quite frank, there's already a guy with almost every power you could really imagine or need hanging around the Marvel Universe already at this point. So Elsa, Jessica, Angel, Blink, Negasonic Teenage Warhead. I think they're probably the biggest characters, and they're all female. So, well, Beak would be a guy. So he's pretty cool as well. So, and then lastly we have Zorn, whose first appearance was this year. maybe.
which you
Or
which you
was
said
it?
you weren't going to expound on.
I'm not.
Is there any particular reason you're not going to?
Yeah, it gives away a huge plot point.
Okay. Okay.
So if you're starting to read those books, remember Zorn is a new character, and you've never seen him before, and he
Gotcha.
doesn't resemble anybody that you know. So anyway,
Books that ended this year. What were some of the notable titles, ongoing titles that ended this year?
well, X-Men ended in air quotes because it turned into new X-Men.
Sure.
But outside of that, we lost Generation X, X-Man, Mutant X, Gambit, who's an X-Men character, X-Men The Hidden Years, which was the Byrne series, Bishop, the last X-Man, X-Men Universe, and Marvel Knights. So
There's a lot of X in there.
of the top like 8 or so that ended, they were X books. So the main X line is still selling really well, and they're still trying some new things, but a lot of the existing X books ended up kind of going by the wayside. I really like Generation X. That's probably the one of those that I would miss the most of the ones that went. So
All right, so let's talk about the bullpen then. Editor in chief Joe Quesada is the man yet again this year. What are we talking as far as staff size? How many people did you have with your big query there gets some sort of creative credit this year?
so this year there were 431 people, 431, who got at least one credit as a writer, penciler, inker, colorist, or letterer in a Marvel story. If someone just did covers or they worked on the ads or whatever, that would not necessarily qualify here. But I think that's probably a pretty accurate listing at this point. I worked on my query again because things had gotten really muddy as the reprints kind of went into overdrive. And actually phoned one of my buddies who's an Excel master. And so I got my stuff out of SQL and he helped me do some stuff in Excel and we got that pretty well. So 431 staff, of whom about 56 had their first Marvel credit this year.
It's a fair number of new
Yeah.
people.
Yep, still small compared to what we'd seen before, but up from what we've been seeing the last couple of years.
You have a note here about a passing that occurred.
Yeah, we lost Gray Morrow, who is a long-term comics creator. He was co-creator of Man-Thing, worked for pretty much all the companies, did a lot of stuff for DC, among others. But he did pass away this year. So.
Gotcha. Okay, so Rookie of the Year for 2001. The 56 people. You
Yep.
had a lot of people to choose from. Who were the ones that were kind of in contention to be the considered for Rookie of the Year? And then we'll talk about who the winner of the Rookie of the Year is.
So it was a good year. There were a lot of really talented folks who had their first sort of credits for Marvel this year. Mike Allred was one of them. Michael Gaydos, who was working on Alias with our man Bendis. Greg Rucka, who's going to be one of my favorite writers. He's writing Queen and Cuttree as well in 2001, even as he's doing some stuff for Marvel. Sean McKeever, who's going to go on to do a bunch of stuff for Marvel over the next years. And then lastly, we also do have one person named Randolph Gentle, who is going to be doing a ton of stuff for Marvel in the next few years as a letterer. He's worked for a number of different companies doing like sharp font, virtual calligraphy, so under different kind of houses and the like. But he's going to have a lot of credits coming up as well. Still, though, I think there's one name that pretty clearly wins this one, for me at least.
This is a name I instantly recognized. He was brought in, had a really successful run on Spider-Man. Who is our Rookie of the Year for 2001?
J. Michael Straczynski. So really good writer, did a ton of stuff for television, and he's worked with the Marvel Studios a lot. More than that, though, his run on Thor is one of my favorite runs of Thor of the last probably 20, 30 years. And he's the one that took Thor and brought Asgard down into Oklahoma and just sort of put all of the Asgardians in
Yes.
amongst this sort of rural community. It was a lot of fun. But also the look that he and Oliver Quipel set up in that really translates very closely to what you see in the movie. So I think that um, some of the grounded aspects of bringing Thor down to earth and making him more human that are in the movie, I think, come right out of some of Straczynski's Thor run. And then for Spider-Man too, he already in his first year wins the best series or best storyline. Um, really, really a good writer.
Came back just a couple years ago. He's now doing Captain America currently, I believe.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely a fan. I got to meet him at the Phoenix Fan Fusion a couple of years ago.
Oh, very cool. Very
Bef-
cool indeed.
Before we go, Dan, your favorite Marvel comic from 2001?
So this is tough as well. They actually had so much good stuff. I loved Alias from the time it came out. All the other Bendis books, Daredevil stuff he's working on, I was enjoying. The new X-Men was a lot of fun with a lot of the crazy stuff they were doing there. Daredevil Yellow was actually really fun.
It was.
But I'm gonna go with Wolverine Origins because I looked forward to that book, and it was something that we all wanted to know what Marvel was going to do as far as an origin for Wolverine, and were they going to screw it up? And I got done, and at the end, I was pretty happy. And I think that's all you can ask for when someone tries to give an answer to something that's been a question for that long. If it's just something that satisfies you and you like the story, then that's probably pretty spectacular. So it was a good story, had a lot of impact for the future of the character, and they didn't screw it up.
Oh, yeah. That works. Well, that is a lot. And I think that actually wraps it up for us this week. We're going to have a lot of interesting stuff to talk about with regards to Daredevil next week. That Daredevil Yellow that you touched on, I think,
Yep.
was, outside of the main run, which was really good. That was a series that it seemed like every time I would go online and see some of the best Daredevil runs, that was one of the ones that was listed, and it ends up being kind of a retelling of the origin story again, which we've had a few of, but it was still so good.
Really a retelling almost of the first like 5 or 6 issues because you get a lot of the first
it's actually
of
like the 8 issues, because issue 8 is the issue with the Purple Man.
Is that the Purple Man? Yep, that would be it then.
But we're going to save that for next week. And for now, that is going to wrap it up for us. We'd like to thank you all for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help other new users find the show that much easier. And whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts on this week's show. Maybe you read some of these great comics from 2001. We'd love to get your thoughts on those. You can send those to us via email. That address is comments@comicsovertime.com, or you can reach out via social media. We're on X or Blue Sky @comicsovertime. Dan, I'm looking forward to talking Daredevil next week. We got Brian Michael Bendis doing some books in the middle of the year. Had the wrap up for the spotlight from last week, and then we get another really interesting story as well, and Daredevil Yellow.
Yep, good times, all sorts of good stuff.
All right, until then, take care, everybody.
See you later, folks.